We just learned a lot about Rivian's autonomy roadmap, specifically when it comes to R2, and there's a lot to dive into, so let's talk about it. Earlier today, Rivian's head of software, Wassym Bensaid, hosted an Ask Me Anything session on Reddit, and we learned a lot of really cool stuff about all of the software and tech that's going into the R2. But there was also a surprise guest. James Philbin, Rivian's head of autonomy, also answered a few questions. And he shed some light on a lot of stuff that's great that kind of gives us a better idea of exactly what Rivian's roadmap is. And a lot of the questions revolved around the Gen 2 hardware versus the Gen 3 hardware and what capabilities are, what's coming this year, all of that stuff. So I want to go over what he said and then share some of my thoughts about it, because this may actually impact your purchase decision for the R2. Before we dive into the questions that he answered, I first want to give a quick recap of what autonomy hardware is available, what's coming on R2, and what's going forward. So right now we have the Gen 2 autonomy system on the R1. And this consists of 5 radars, 1 in each corner and 1 on the front fascia, as well as 11 cameras throughout the vehicle. The launch edition of R2 also has the same Gen 2 system. Well, I say same, it is slightly different, but not in a way that most people will notice. The cameras have slightly better dynamic range, and the corner radars are a little bit different because they're doing double duty as parking sensors as well. But for all intents and purposes, it's the same autonomy system that we have on the Gen 2 R1s. And that's what's going to be shipping for the rest of this year. Early next year, Rivian is going to launch their Gen 3 autonomy system on R2. This is the one that everyone's been talking about that has LiDAR, and it has the new RAP1 processor that has way more compute headroom. The cameras and the radars are most likely going to stay the same. It's just the addition of a LiDAR and the extra processing power. So the natural question is, what's going to be the difference in performance between the two, and should I wait for Gen 3? So on that note, the first question that James responded to was exactly that. What's going to be the difference in capability? And this is what his answer was. So he starts off by talking about the launch edition of the R2 that's going to have the Gen 2 hardware, reviewing the different specs here, 400 sparse tops, 11 cameras, 5 radars, all of that stuff. But this is the part that I think is the most important, where he's talking about why they're putting LiDAR in the vehicle. He says that it forms the foundation of an improved data flywheel for our large driving model, with benefits that accrue to the entire Gen 2 Plus fleets, regardless of sensor suite. We do not expect a noticeable difference between LiDAR and non-LiDAR vehicles for some time. And he actually later goes into a little bit more detail about what that timeline looks like. But this is kind of what I've talked a little bit about before, where Rivian's primary motive for putting a LiDAR on R2 is actually not to use it as a sensor for driving, at least not initially. Their primary motive for putting it on the R2 is to help gather training data, because Rivian has a very, very much smaller fleet than Tesla does. Tesla has many times over more vehicles driving around that are able to collect data that they can train their AI models on. But Rivian doesn't have that advantage, and they need to move fast in order to stay competitive. And so in order to fill this gap, they need to gather higher quality data. And that's where the LiDAR comes in. The LiDAR has very high amounts of precision and resolution for gauging the depth of how far away different objects are. And they can feed this data into their training model alongside the camera feeds and the radar feeds, and they can use that to train those systems to become more accurate. So basically what that means is, with this more high quality data coming in, they can get better results faster out of their AI models. And this applies to both Gen 2 and Gen 3 vehicles. So even though the LiDAR isn't necessarily going to be used as a driving sensor, so to speak, right at the start, it will absolutely make Gen 2 vehicles much better alongside Gen 3. And in later answers, he goes into a little bit more detail about what these capabilities are and what the timeline more or less that they're expecting is. And on this question, it's a very similar sort of question, what's going to be the difference between the two platforms? But there's a couple of cool little nuggets in here that I want to highlight that I think are very interesting. And the first one is talking about just the built-in free autonomy features versus autonomy plus. He says, since all autonomy features are based on the same underlying technology, the base autonomy features will continue to improve along with the new autonomy plus features. And this kind of goes along with what I discovered when I tried the free hands-on version of Rivian's autonomy. If you haven't seen my video covering the free version of Highway Assist, you can check it out here. But basically what I surmised from that is it's using the same underlying driving model, it just has a more restricted feature set. So the nice thing is as Autonomy Plus improves and as Universal Hands-Free improves, so does the free version of Highway Assist. So that's pretty cool. He then goes on to clarify a little bit more about the LiDAR versus non-LiDAR, Gen 3 versus Gen 2. He says, LiDAR on the R2 will have the same core feature set as non-LiDAR vehicles, including Autonomy Plus, with the main difference being that over time, LiDAR vehicles will require less supervision, including greater eyes-off support. So there's a couple of things that we can glean from this. The first one is he's reiterating that Gen 2 hardware will have hands-off, eyes-off capability, but LiDAR will have larger eyes-off capability. What I'm assuming that this will look like is Gen 2 will have limited scenarios where you can go hands off, eyes off. Think freeway driving in certain areas, certain traffic conditions, things like that. Whereas LiDAR might enable you to do it in more locations. Perhaps it'll do it in certain surface streets or things like that. He's not really going into detail here, probably because he doesn't want to make any promises that he can't keep just yet. But that's where they're going with this, is eventually when Gen 3 hardware does perform differently, that's where you'll notice it, is it will have more domain or more area that it can function with eyes off. But that timeline he still hasn't mentioned yet, so let's keep going. And this one is where we seem to get a little bit better idea of what the timeline is of Gen 2 versus Gen 3 capabilities starting to diverge. In previous videos, I've postulated that it will probably be like a year or so before Gen 3 hardware starts performing differently than Gen 2, because initially it's just going to be a data collection device like we talked about. But here, he actually says something interesting. He says, we expect autonomous capabilities to be largely the same for the next several years, talking about Gen 2 versus Gen 3. And I think this is going to be the big one that will impact a lot of people's decisions on buying R2, because I know lots of people are wanting to wait for that Gen 3 hardware to come out before they decide to buy R2. And based on what this is saying, it may be 2-3 years before there's actually a meaningful difference between the two platforms. In that first answer that we looked at, he actually specifically called out the fact that the Gen 2 hardware still has a lot of headroom left on it, and there's a lot of room to grow. So that's kind of nice to know. And he also specifically clarifies Gen 2 vehicles will also improve as a result of Gen 3, again, that data collection. With the critical 3D ground truth data from the LiDAR giving us the training data to allow Gen 2 to make the most of their already advanced sensor constellation. So it's really nice to see that both of these platforms are going to grow together. Gen 2 is far from a dead platform. All right, so now that we've talked about R2 hardware, let's talk about the point-to-point self-driving software and where we are on the timeline with that. They've said many times that they're releasing point-to-point self-driving by the end of this year. And that appears to be true, but we're getting a little bit more detail on that. Here he specifically says there's a public rollout of point-to-point assisted hands-free later this year, followed by a widespread rollout in the first half of 2027. It's hard to say exactly what this means, but basically what that sounds like is point-to-point self-driving is coming out this year, but it's going to be somewhat of a limited release. Whether that means that it's limited in the areas and situations that it'll work, or maybe that means that it's limited to a certain number of drivers and users. It's hard to say, but it is going to be some sort of limited rollout that is happening this year, with a more widespread universal rollout happening next year. What I'm gleaning from that is that may mean that they're waiting for the new R2 with LiDAR to start hitting the road so that they can get some more training validation data before they do a full rollout. And again, remember, the data collected by the R2 with LiDAR will benefit Gen 2 and Gen 3 vehicles for the next several years. But before we even get to point-to-point autonomy, there's definitely a lot of features that are going to be genuinely helpful that we'll get along the way. He also mentions Universal Hands-Free Phase 2. Universal Hands-Free Phase 2, he calls out as having stoplight and stop sign recognition, so it'll actually automatically stop for those, which will be very nice. We'll have lane changes that happen automatically on surface streets. As of right now, it will only do that on the freeway. And he also mentions auto parking, which will presumably be part of this phase 2 rollout. So we'll get a nice set of features within the next couple of months, he says. So that's great. I'm very excited, and you know I will be testing that. But there was one interesting omission. On Rivian's website, they actually only mentioned 2 features as being part of Autonomy Plus that are coming soon. Those 2 features are auto parking, which he did call out, and the other one is end-to-end autonomy on the freeway, where from on-ramp to off-ramp, it will drive entirely autonomously, deciding when to change lanes, taking interchanges, and all of that stuff. And he, interestingly, at least from what I saw in the Ask Me Anything, he brought up phase 2 a couple of times, but he never mentioned that particular feature. So either that feature is being dropped as part of phase 2, or maybe it's still in there, but he just didn't make specific note of it. But interesting to call out. So there you have it. We have a little bit better timeline of what's happening with autonomy, what the difference between Gen 2 and Gen 3 hardware is realistically going to be for the next couple of years. And it all sounds quite promising. In a previous video, I actually specifically mentioned that I wanted to wait for the Gen 3 hardware because I already have a vehicle with Gen 2. However, now that we have confirmation that it will likely be a few years before we even see a meaningful difference between the 2 platforms, I'm starting to rethink that decision because the R2 Launch Edition is a really great value. So we'll see. I'm going to continue to monitor the situation and feel it out, but I really appreciate the extra detail that we got from James and Wassym on the front of autonomy and just general tech. If you're interested, I highly recommend checking out the Rivian Tracker article. Jose wrote a great write-up about all of this stuff that we learned about the autonomy timeline, and I'll have that linked down below. So stay tuned. I will definitely be testing all of this as it rolls out. So hit subscribe so you don't miss any of that testing. And if you're interested in buying an R1, use my referral code down below. It'll give you up to 500 points on the gear shop and some free charging. But regardless of whether it's R1 or R2, it sounds like Rivian is full steam ahead with autonomy, and I can't wait to test these new features. Until next time.